Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and in this discussion I talk to Professor Emerita Joan Eakin of Toronto University, Canada. Joan's interests are best described as extensive. Concretely, she has investigated the social dimensions of work and health in or across a range of real-world situations and contexts. However, in addition to empiric research, Professor Eakin's theoretic scholarship is no less engaging. Reflecting her concern with qualitative research methodology, health-related critical social science and social theory more broadly, today we discuss her 2020 paper, Value-Adding Analysis, Doing More with Qualitative Data. This work, jointly authored with Brenda Gladstone, appeared in the International Journal of Qualitative Methodology, and in my view, Professor Eakin here presents a series of challenges to qualitative researchers that many will find disturbing. Thus, the work dramatically states that much qualitative research produces little new knowledge. We argue that this is largely due to deficits of analysis. Researchers too seldom venture beyond cataloguing data into pre-existing concepts and scouting for themes. And much of the qualitative health research being done is underperforming and is generating little new knowledge. End of quote. Moreover, stressing the place and the importance of the researcher's creative presence in analysis done well, absent this presence, to quote, data are often suboptimally penetrated, with researchers venturing little beyond surface meanings in pre-existing conceptual frameworks and failing to question the extant understandings of the objects of inquiry. This inadequacy, we propose, stems from the investigator's inability to maximize the potential of qualitative inquiry, most particularly its capacity for critical and creative analysis and interpretation, end of quote. Now, to remedy these ills of analysis, it's proposed that imaginative and creative data theorization offers a means of adding value to qualitative findings. Please, Joan, can you outline the argument of your paper for us? In what way can value adding enhance qualitative outputs, and most importantly, what shortcomings does value adding meet or overcome?
Well, thank you, Martin. I'm delighted to participate in this conversation with you. As you say, let me start with our claim that particularly qualitative health research is underperforming. So much of what is produced doesn't produce new knowledge. It merely catalogs qualitative data into conventional wisdom. It tells us little more really than we already know. It's not so much that this research is wrong, as much as it fails to maximize the tremendous potential of qualitative research for insight and understanding that's not available through other forms of research inquiry. So this form of research is not as powerful as it could be. So this paper is about what qualitative research can do, and it tries to offer some guidance on how to exploit that potential and add value to what is produced. So we argue, as you said, that the inadequacies of qualitative research lie most significantly in analysis. Of course, other parts of research are extremely important. I'm not saying it's the only part that matters, but analysis is a particular point of failure in my view. It's the Achilles heel, I would argue, at the site of the biggest weakness. The analysis is essentially a black box in qualitative research. In textbooks for how to do it, they usually peter out by the time you get to the analysis part. It's maybe a chapter, and it's in kind of generalities where you sort of think you get it, but then you don't actually think you're doing it, and it's very hard to relate to. And in teaching, I mean, we found there was hardly any, certainly in the health sciences, there was no courses given for graduate students beyond the introductory level. They never get to, maybe there's a final class given on analysis. So it really is a black box. It's somehow mysterious. People don't know how to express it, whether it's, people don't know how to talk about it, or whether in fact it's a very idiosyncratic personal thing, which it is to a very large extent, which is, always a challenge in science, which is so based in the idea that it's it's a set of procedures that you do, and not something that's relates to an individual researcher. So first of all, in the paper, we try to discuss the principles of the sort of analysis that we're trying to lay out, how it's grounded in an understanding of analysis as interpretation. Data never speak for themselves. They always are interpreted. So it's an interpretive exercise. Also, analysis is contextualization, meaning that meaning is always in relation to the circumstances in which it is located, that produces it. And we also argue that analysis draws centrally on the creativity of the researcher. And we can talk more about that, but the researcher has to be present and not absent from the research, which is more the model of more positivist and quantitative research, where the effort is to get the researcher out of the research rather than in it. And the last kind of principle is that the analysis has to be critical. In other words, it must trouble existing assumptions and understandings of things, and it must inquire into the workings of power in whatever phenomenon it is that you're studying. So after laying out some of these principles, we then moved toward providing some practical strategies. We wanted the paper not to be yet another kind of general kind of statement, but actually to offer some concrete guidance for how do you go about thinking like that? How do you go about generating value in analysis? So we talk about things we call devices, which are really just strategies for seeing your data in different ways, for being able to generate concepts, which in our view are the most important thing that qualitative research can do. It's in the business of creating concepts, and it's the concepts that are useful for understanding things. And we suggest that theorization is really important, and we offer tips for how to go about doing that, what it means to theorize data, and how it can enhance and deepen your insight into whatever it is you're studying. And also, more importantly, it allows you to generalize. Now, I'm not talking about statistical generalizability here. I'm talking about conceptual generalizability. That is achieving a level of abstraction above and beyond the particular that you're studying, the particular empirical observations that you've got. And it allows your knowledge to inform other things besides what you're studying. That's where its value lies. So we talk about that. And this emphasis on theorizing also challenges and generalization challenges some of the prevailing narrative that says that qualitative research really can do no more than describe, and it can't explain, or it can't deal with causality. We feel that value-added qualitative research can and does do all of those things. So as you can see, much of what's in the paper is either novel or disturbing, as you said, Martin, or controversial, out and out rejected in some cases. So that is the point of really departure and of ending, that the paper stirs up a bunch of things that have been lying kind of unlooked at and dormant for perhaps forever. I don't know, certainly in my world, in the health sciences world, it has been. So that's where I will end my little summary, and perhaps you can respond to some pieces of it and ask me about particular elements.
Yes, I'd like to. Now, in the introduction, for example, you state, and to quote, "Our value-adding approach to qualitative analysis was distilled from many years of practicing and teaching qualitative research methodology in a very distinct research environment, the Health Sciences Academy, where the philosophy, logic, and practices of research tend to be epistemologically and methodologically very different from those underlying qualitative forms of inquiry, end of quote. Now, can you say a little bit more about the difference that you're pointing to there? Because I think it plays quite an important role in your thinking.
Yes, it certainly does. I mean, I was trained as a sociologist, but my career was spent in medicine and public health. And I found, of course, that everything I knew was the context in which I was trying to put forward my ideas as a social scientist and my ideas as a qualitative researcher. Boy, they didn't fit so well in there. And my sociology colleagues who were practicing in a very different environment could hardly understand what was wrong with me. I mean, what's the big deal? They could not get the difference between doing qualitative research in a social science friendly environment and doing it in the health sciences. It's not that they weren't friendly, but when I first started to do, I was trained as a medical sociologist. So at the very beginning, this is in the 70s, in the very beginning, it was the fact that I was talking about the social that was quite disturbing to the medical folk I was talking to. You know, they didn't know what the social meant really. And that was the novel part of what I was bringing to the field of medicine and bioscience. And then gradually it became kind of a bit more accepted. Yeah, there really is something in there in health and healthcare that's about the social and the psychological and the political. I mean, there was this vague sense, well, yeah, maybe there are those things playing out here and it's not just about biology and chemistry and whatever. But then it became, well, what kind of science what are you doing? Because the method was so different. It violated every conceivable rule that most medical scientists were operating under. The randomized clinical trial is the apex of the methodological food chain. Qualitative research is at the bottom, and they explicitly put it at the bottom because it doesn't follow certain procedures. It viewed as just basically you're kind of making it all up, and you make a few observations, and you haven't got enough people to use statistically. From a positivist perspective, it's a very suspect methodology. So there was the constant struggle to say, well, this approach to knowledge yields something that can actually be useful to medicine. I mean, I was in an applied field where I was trying to generate knowledge that was useful for people who were doing healthcare. I wasn't a sociologist trying to, do something really highfalutin and whatever. I was trying to shed some light on places that traditional health sciences couldn't shine light on, couldn't go. And so, but over the years, of course, it became more popular because, in fact, it related to what many, many health practitioners, not necessarily researchers, health practitioners knew. They have an understanding of what they're working with that isn't reflected in the scientific literature. They know, I mean, clinical practice, it involves all the kinds of things that qualitative research can get at and bring out and points to. So intuitively, qualitative research was quite appealing to the healthcare providers anyway, health practitioners. And gradually, the interest amongst researchers grew for many, many reasons, not all to do with the fact that it resonated with their kind of philosophical and practice experience, but also because it seemed easier than going and doing statistics if you needed a quickie master's degree or whatever, right? So you think, oh, well, I mean, all you do is a few interviews and, write up your results and there you've got it, right? This qualitative research stuff is terrific. So, yeah, go ahead.
But I thought you were saying something slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that the paper concludes with a statement to the effect that a really good question generates more questions, And throughout the paper, you repeatedly take to task the idea that it would be possible to have a set of tools or methods that we would just work our way through and get to the right answer. And so your version of qualitative analysis and qualitative inquiry, I think, is slightly at odds with the way in which a lot, not all, but a lot of qualitative research is conceptualized within healthcare and by nurses, where the need to generate conclusions which can inform practice maybe leads to the idea that there is a method that you just apply and then something drops out at the bottom.
Yes.
Have I misinterpreted you?
No, I agree with you. You have not, misunderstood what I'm saying. I think I tend to call that positivist qualitative research. Because in fact, in my view, unfortunately, it doesn't meet adequacy as a qualitative methodology or as a positivist or a quantitative methodology. It certainly fails all the quantitative ones. It hasn't got a good sample, and it's not random, and it's not controlled, and all those things. I mean, especially lack of control, which is the watermark of real research, right? If you can control everything. And they work with qualitative data, but they don't do qualitative analysis. And that's the big distinction. So they say, well, we're doing qualitative research because we did a semi-structured interview, and we went through and we found themes and whatever, and we didn't count. So it's not that they're not working with qualitative data. Where I come apart with it is that they don't do qualitative analysis.
Okay. Now, it's quite difficult to, I think, summarize your claims about analysis, because actually they are so interesting and they travel so quickly through a number of different spheres of analysis. But you break analysis into analysis of interpretation, analysis of contextualization, analysis of creative presence, analysis as critical inquiry. Now, you have mentioned or touched upon one or two of those, but could you just say a little bit more about, for example, interpretation?
Well, I think the important thing there is that a lot of qualitative research tends to take words, which are the usual, the most common kind of data that people word. They take it at face value. They take it in its literal sense. They make all sorts of assumptions about who said it and what they meant. And then so they don't problematize what's on the paper. That's taken as being the data. And so being meaning-centered and being interpretation-centered is that everything has to be interpreted, and things are interpreted right from the beginning. You're talking to, let's say you're doing an interview, the person who you're talking with is interpreting their own experience. They are reconstructing it in some kind of a way. They're making an interpretation. Perhaps they never even thought about the thing that you've asked them about. So they're kind of, whatever, providing what they think maybe you want, or there's the complexity of what they're actually telling you is already a highly interpretive, complicated act. Then let's say you've taped it. Then you translate that taping into a transcript. Well, oh my God! I mean, everything's lost. All the visuals, everything is lost from the tape. So much is lost between the tape and the page. So that's already. And then you've got, of course, maybe typists who do the transcriptions, who take liberties with the text to tidy it up a little bit, clean it up, whatever. Or even they do things that's been shown in some interesting literature that even the typists form likes and dislikes with who they're typing about, and will kind of make them look better or worse, depending. So there's translation, there's interpretation that's going on there when it gets on the page. And then you've got this page with words on it, and you go through with codes that have been preconceived. I mean, I'll have students telling me that they've gone in there with 150 codes that already in their heads before they start, based on, you know, their preconceptions of what's happening, which is not avoidable, because you, of course, you have preconceptions, but the whole point of the analysis is to question all those preconceptions and to put them, you know, look to scrutinize them, not to just catalog what you've got on a page in terms of these preconceived notions. So like coding, instead of being a matter of having a set of codes that you apply to words on the page, is actually, coding is analysis. You're doing analysis as you're doing it. You take from the words into your codes, not, you don't put codes onto the words. You use the words to help you generate the codes. You generate codes. The codes are the working material of your concepts that are going to develop, and your ideas that are going to develop. It's part of the analysis. So it's not treated as a procedure where you do coding, you labor through your text and you code paragraphs as being X or Y. The kind of qualitative analysis that we're talking about is much more engaged, much more two-way than that kind of the standard approach to analysis. Okay. I've left your question, I'm sure, a mile in the dust. I'm sorry.
Well, no, the two things which I was thinking about just at the end there were the idea, which is also in your paper, that everything is data, and also that writing is analysis. Would you say a little bit more about everything is data?
Well, everything is data. I think from my point of view, everything is data is perhaps the most important kind of little phrase that I've ever put out there as a teacher. You know, people who think that research is about controlling everything can't tolerate the idea that everything could be data. Data is what you say in your protocol you're going to collect, and then you analyze, and then you come to conclusions about your results, etc. Whereas our notion of data is that it's out there everywhere. It's in your head in terms of your own experience. It's in the literature, things that you read. It's in signs in the subway. It's in a whole bunch of other things. And studies I did of small business operators, for example, it resided in their dirty fingernails and the absence of a telephone in their office, and in, you know, all these additional things that they were the richest, by far the most richest data that I collected on things that I was studying were the things that weren't in the protocol. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know they were going to be data. So everything is data just means to be alert to all the other stuff, and you can use it. It gives you freedom to say, use it in your thinking, in the way you approach it, in your theorizing, in reinforcing certain ideas, or maybe contradicting. It's not as though they all reinforce what you're thinking. Some of them contradict what you're thinking. And that's important too, to have things to play off all this data. You're not limited to those words in the page, which we already know are so incredibly confining, and so they're so produced by their context that they don't let you go with what you're really getting after. So I think the everything is data really just loosens people up to feel free to use all these other sources of knowledge, including what you know yourself, your own experiences, which in classic research is expunged from the exercise. You got to get rid of it. It's bias, right? You cannot be there. You cannot draw on anything during the conduct of the research. Whereas in qualitative, the kind of qualitative research that I would put forward, you use everything you've got to try to make sense of maybe the formal data that you've got, but to make sense of the topic, of the whole that you're working with.
Are you advocating essentially for a form of quite nuanced hermeneutic thinking, analysis, inquiry?
Well, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that question, but hermeneutic for sure, in the sense that it's 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 about interpretation. It's about how we go about understanding things. And I've always, students keep saying to me things like, well, how do we know that it's right? That we got it right. And I say, well, that's not the point. As a researcher, certainly as a qualitative researcher, all you can do is work with what you've got, treat everything as data, conceptualize your material as best you can, and you can offer your interpretation of what's going on there. That's all you can do. But you have to do it, you have to be convincing. Nobody's going to believe you just because you say, I think this. You have to make an argument for why you think that. You have to put forward a reasoned interpretation of what you've, a grounded interpretation. It's not miles away from the data. It is grounded in real world stuff, but you're working with it, you're interpreting it, and you're offering an interpretation that you think might be of use to practitioners, might inform people who are involved in health and healthcare. That yes, it's an interpretation. That's all you can do, is offer a good, solid, usable, valuable in some way interpretation.
How does your argument fit into or alongside similar other arguments currently aired by, I'm thinking here of Sally Thorne? The thrust of your argument, the idea that qualitative research cannot simply conclude with theme identification, does seem to be one which is gaining traction. How does your thinking fit in with other people pursuing similar threads?
It's totally aligned with that idea, is that theming, looking for themes, is problematic. It just doesn't take you terribly far. For one thing, themes don't reside in the data. And often it's treated as though they're sitting there waiting for you to be clever enough to go in there and to see what the themes are in the data. And so that's problematic, because they don't reside there, because, as we've just discussed, it's so interpretive. So certainly I agree with that. There's a form of research called thematic analysis, which kind of builds on the idea that the point of the exercise is to go in there and find the themes. And it's not, that's about as far as I agree with that stuff, that the themes are a problem. And I think one of the reasons Sally seems to think, and I don't want to, this isn't a critique of Sally as much as to say, she seems to be saying that you have to go beyond themes. Yeah, you find some themes, but you got to go beyond them. In some respects, I think that themes are actually, can be damaging to even go in with the idea of themes. It's not going beyond themes. Don't go towards themes, in a way, because I think it's not so much that what the themes that you find are not true. I don't think that's the relevant questions. It's just that when you get preoccupied with themes, it's what you don't see. It stops you from seeing other things. And so, I would put emphasis more on, I completely agree that themes are a bit of a shortcut. And goodness knows, there's lots of, every second study will say it's doing grounded theory. And they're not doing grounded theory at all. They don't even know. It's just that in the health sciences, you need to label your method. You need to put stamp on it to say what kind of analysis it is. So everybody says, oh, I'm doing grounded theory. But I was trained in grounded theory. I'm of that generation that was trained in it. And they're not doing grounded theory at all. They're using maybe some of the ideas, maybe the constant comparative perhaps, and very good ideas for sure, but they're not doing grounded theory. But it's a label that gets slapped on these things. But in terms of the theming, I would agree with that literature, and agree with the fact that it's problematic. there's literature now that's talking or problematizing things like generic research. That what about all that health-related research that doesn't adhere to any particular theoretical tradition or even any methodological stream. It just is generic. It just goes in there and finds some things interesting and says it. So what do we do with those kinds of, that kind of product? Is it useless? Does it have some value? How can we, do we start with that and then try and kind of make it a little bit better? There's a lot of discussion of that kind of stuff. And, you know, it obviously resonates with the kind of position that I have too. The challenge for people in the health sciences, like myself, but I think more so for perhaps people in nursing, actually in more applied fields, although I'm in public health, and at the moment, certainly that's absolutely in the eye of the storm, but is that you've got, you don't want to, you want to be accepted. You want to be legitimate. And so half of you is wanting to embrace all the new people that have come into, that have rushed into qualitative research. And you want to embrace them and say, well, you're doing good stuff. You could just do it a little bit better, you know, keep at it. And I'm glad that you realize that this is a good way that you can go about, you know, generating knowledge and so on. But it's not hard enough. Well, I really think that qualitative research has to be methodologically much more critical of itself. It has to be much more methodologically conscious. And that includes self-critique and not just about rigor, because rigor is really, the way it's framed in the qualitative field is mostly about, have you done, you know, all these procedures, like have you done, what's it, not peer review, you know, when you give your data or your analysis back to who you've interviewed.
Member checking.
Member checking, yeah, right, member checking, without the slightest thought about member checking makes no sense whatsoever, certainly from a hermeneutic point of view, where, I mean, what are you getting? There isn't one truth out there. The person you go back to may have never thought about those ideas, have changed their mind since they last talked to you, don't want to tell you something for political reasons, a whole bunch of reasons that are to do with the very meaning of what you're asking about. It makes no sense to go in there member checking to see if you've got it right. But there's a tendency, well, you know, we want the procedures, so we do those things. And so, I mean, I don't know where I started. I'm just saying, I think methodology is of prime importance to qualitative research, to be thoughtful and reflexive about what we're doing ourselves.
Joan, I thought that was really interesting. I think it's a paper which I very much hope gains a great deal of traction and interest. I think it certainly deserves to be widely read. Thank you for your time today. That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It always is a pleasure to talk about this.
Thank you, Joan.